On the distant planet of Selvera, inside the grand palace of the Varian Empire, King Tyrell sat on his towering throne, his sharp golden eyes filled with disappointment. His daughter, Princess Zahira, stood before him, her head bowed. She was nothing like the fierce warriors of their royal bloodline. She was weak, timid, and frail, a shame to the Empire. "I have made my decision." The king's voice echoed through the hall. "You are no longer my burden to carry." Zahira's heart pounded. She had spent her whole life trying to prove herself, yet nothing was ever enough. She had trained, studied, and fought, but her body was not as strong as her father's or her brother's. She was always reminded that she would never be worthy of the throne. Beside the king stood a human, a tall, battle-hardened warrior named Connor Voss. He had scars from past battles, and his piercing blue eyes scanned Zahira with curiosity rather than judgment. "This is my gift to you, human," the king said, smirking. "Take her. Train her if you wish, or leave her to rot. She is useless to me." Zahira clenched her fists, gifted away like an object, a deal between powerful rulers. She wanted to scream, to refuse, but she had no choice. Zelvera's laws were absolute. If her father had decided her fate, there was no changing it. Connor raised an eyebrow, but said nothing for a long moment. Then he let out a short chuckle. "You're giving me a princess. That's new. She is nothing but a title." The king spat. "A princess in name only. Take her, and she's your problem now." Zahira glanced at Connor. The human warrior was an enigma to her. She had heard of humans before, how they were unpredictable, chaotic, and impossibly stubborn. They were a species that thrived under pressure, always adapting, always pushing their limits. Was this what her father wanted? To humiliate her by sending her to live among those he considered lesser beings? "Fine," Connor finally said, shrugging. "I'll take her." Zahira's breath hitched. Just like that, she was no longer a princess of Selvera. The king waved his hand dismissively, and the guards escorted Zahira toward Connor's ship. She didn't fight it. There was no point. As she stepped onto the cold metallic ramp leading inside, she stole one last glance at her father. He wasn't even looking at her. Tears burned at the edge of her vision, but she refused to let them fall. If this was her fate, then she would find her own way forward. And maybe, just maybe, she would prove them all wrong. The spaceship's doors sealed shut with a hiss, and Princess Zahira felt the ground beneath her shift as the engines roared to life. She was leaving Selvera, her home, her people, her past, everything she had ever known. Across from her, Connor Voss, the human warrior, leaned against the metal wall of his ship, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. "You don't talk much, do you?" he finally said. Zahira remained silent. What was there to say? She had been abandoned, given away like an object, sent to live with a human who barely cared about her existence. Connor sighed and shook his head. "Look, princess." "I am no longer a princess," Zahira interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. Connor raised an eyebrow. "All right. Then what are you?" Zahira hesitated. She had no answer. Without her title, without her place in Selvera's royal court, who was she? "Doesn't matter," Connor said. "You're here now, and I don't take in useless people." Zahira clenched her fists. That word again. Useless. That's what they all thought of her. The ship rumbled as it entered the atmosphere of Earth. Through the window, Zahira saw the planet's surface. Vast blue oceans, green forests, and golden deserts. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Selvera was a planet of steel and fire, built for war. But Earth, it looked alive. The ship landed in an open field, surrounded by towering mountains. The moment the doors opened, a rush of cool, fresh air hit Zahira's face. "Welcome to your new home," Connor said, stepping outside. Zahira followed, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The ground felt strange beneath her feet, lighter. The gravity on Earth was different from Selvera's heavier atmosphere. Connor pointed toward a simple, rugged building in the distance. That's where you'll be staying. As they walked, Zahira noticed a group of humans nearby. Warriors, like Connor. They were training, fighting with weapons and bare hands. Their movements were precise, powerful, and disciplined. One of them, a tall woman with dark hair and a sharp gaze, noticed Zahira and smirked. That's the alien princess. Doesn't look like much. Zahira tensed. The words stung, but she didn't react. She had heard them too many times before. Connor didn't defend her. Instead, he turned to Zahira. They're right, you know. If you want to survive here, you have to prove yourself. Zahira looked at the warriors training. She had been given away, treated as worthless. But now, she had a chance to become something more. She turned to Connor, her violet eyes burning with quiet determination. Then teach me. Connor's lips curled into a small, approving smirk. All right, alien. Let's see what you're made of. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Zahira was jolted awake by the sound of Connor Voss's voice. Up. Now. She groggily sat up, her body still sore from yesterday's journey. The cold air bit at her skin, but she forced herself to move. If she hesitated, Connor would see it as weakness. The human warrior stood outside the barracks, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Behind him, several other human soldiers were already training, sparring, running, and lifting heavy weights. They moved with such ease, such confidence. Zahira swallowed. She had no idea what was coming, but she refused to show fear. Connor tossed something at her feet, a weighted vest. Put it on, he ordered. She picked it up, and the moment she strapped it to her chest, the unexpected weight nearly crushed her. It was far heavier than she had imagined. Good. Now run, Connor said, nodding toward a steep hill in the distance. Zahira blinked. Run. Yes. 10 laps. Fast. Her heart pounded, but she did not argue. Taking a deep breath, she pushed forward, her boots sinking into the dirt. The vest dragged her down, making every step feel like she was wading through deep water. By the time she reached the top of the first hill, her legs were shaking. The sun rose higher, burning against her skin. Sweat dripped down her forehead. And she still had 9 more laps to go. From the training ground, some of the human soldiers laughed, whispering among themselves. She could hear them clearly. She won't last. Too weak. Why did Connor even bother with her? Zahira gritted her teeth. She had heard these words before, on Selvera from her own people. And now, even here on Earth, she was still the outsider, the failure. Her vision blurred, her muscles screamed, and her lungs burned. She wanted to stop, but stopping meant proving them right. A deep anger lit inside her. Not this time. She forced herself forward, ignoring the pain, pushing through every burning muscle. One step, then another. Hours passed. When she finally collapsed at the bottom of the hill after her final lap, the world spun around her. Her entire body felt like it was on fire. Connor walked up, towering over her. He didn't look disappointed. In fact, he almost looked impressed. You didn't quit, he said. Zahira looked up, her vision still blurry. I don't quit. Connor smirked. Good, because this was just the beginning. Zahira's hands clenched into fists. She had survived the first trial, and she was ready for more. To be continued. The next morning, Zahira woke up with her entire body aching. Her muscles screamed in protest as she tried to sit up. Every inch of her felt bruised and heavy, but she refused to stay down. She pushed herself out of bed, gritting her teeth against the pain. If she showed weakness, Connor would make her train even harder. She wasn't going to give him a reason to doubt her. When she stepped outside, she found Connor already waiting for her, arms crossed. The other human warriors were there too, watching. Some smirked, expecting her to give up. Thought you'd sleep in, Connor said, tilting his head. Zahira lifted her chin. I am ready. Connor gave a small nod, then tossed her a wooden staff. She caught it awkwardly, her fingers tightening around the unfamiliar weapon. Today we fight, Connor said. Zahira's heart pounded. She had trained in Selvera's royal court before, but it had been ceremonial combat, slow and controlled. Humans, she suspected, would be different. Connor grabbed a staff of his own and twirled it in his hand effortlessly. Show me what you've got. Zahira lunged forward, swinging her staff with all her strength. But before it could even connect, Connor stepped aside, dodging easily. Too slow. She spun around, trying again, but he blocked her strike effortlessly, barely moving. Is this how you fought back home? He asked, smirking. Because it's not going to work here. Zahira growled in frustration. Her arms burned from the effort, but she refused to stop. She attacked again and again, each strike faster, stronger. Yet, Connor dodged every single one, barely breaking a sweat. Finally, he countered. His staff moved like lightning, knocking hers aside before sweeping her legs out from under her. She hit the ground hard, the air leaving her lungs. The warriors around them laughed. She thought she had a chance. Not so tough after all. Zahira lay there, humiliated, her pride stinging more than her body. Was she really this weak? Had her father been right? Connor crouched beside her, his voice low so only she could hear. You rely too much on power. Strength isn't everything. Use your mind. Zahira blinked up at him, his words sinking in. Use my mind. She sat up, gripping her staff tightly. Again. This time, she didn't charge in blindly. She studied Connor's stance, watching the way he moved. His feet were light, his balance perfect. But there was a pattern. Zahira faked an attack, forcing him to dodge. The moment he moved, she shifted directions at the last second, her staff sweeping toward his exposed side. For the first time, Connor had to block. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes before he smiled. Now you're learning. Zahira exhaled, her confidence growing. Maybe she wasn't hopeless after all. For the first time since leaving Selvera, Zahira felt something stir inside her, a faint, flickering confidence. After her last sparring session, she had finally managed to land a hit on Connor Voss, her human trainer. The memory of his surprised expression stayed with her, feeding a tiny flame of hope. But she knew she couldn't stop there. One lucky move wasn't enough. The morning training began as it always did. Long runs, heavy lifting, and grueling combat drills. Connor watched her closely, offering no words of encouragement. He didn't have to. Every time Zahira stumbled or slowed, the silent, unimpressed look on his face was enough to push her harder. Over time, her movements became sharper. She started predicting her opponent's strikes, countering with speed and precision. While she still stumbled occasionally, her failures only drove her to learn faster. Today's session was different. Connor handed her a blade, a simple human combat knife. Zahira stared at the weapon, feeling its weight in her hand. She had trained with ceremonial swords on her home planet. But this was different. It wasn't elegant or decorative. It was made purely for survival. Weapons are tools, Connor said, as he demonstrated a quick series of slashes and thrusts. They don't win fights on their own. You do. The lesson stuck with her. She realized that her power didn't come from the weapon she held, but from her own determination, creativity, and quick thinking. By mid-afternoon, she faced her toughest challenge yet, sparring against 2 human soldiers. They were seasoned fighters, faster and more experienced than her. The moment the fight began, they attacked relentlessly. Zahira fought back, her movements clumsy at first. But as the battle continued, she remembered Connor's words, use your mind. She began looking for patterns, watching for openings. Instead of charging head-on, she started leading them into each other's paths, forcing them to trip over one another. For a brief moment, She was no longer the weak, unwanted princess of Silvera. She was a warrior in training, holding her ground. When the sparring session ended, Zahira was battered, bruised, and out of breath. But she had won. Both soldiers lay on the ground, laughing and shaking their heads. "Not bad," one of them admitted, a hint of respect in his voice. Connor walked over, studying her. There was no smirk this time, no teasing comment. Instead, he simply nodded. "You're getting it." Zahira felt a small sense of pride. For the first time, she believed she might have what it takes to survive here, to prove to herself and everyone else that she wasn't weak. And deep down, she knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. Weeks passed, and Zahira continued to train harder than ever. With every fight, every grueling drill, she grew more capable. The other humans, once skeptical, started to acknowledge her efforts. Connor, though never overly kind, began to give her subtle nods of approval. But something else was changing. Zahira noticed the human soldiers looking to her, not just as another trainee, but as someone they could rely on. During group exercises, they started asking her for advice. When forming teams, they wanted her on their side. Zahira had never been a leader. Back on Silvera, she had always been dismissed. No one trusted her judgment. No one cared what she had to say. But here, among these humans, things were different. They valued ability, not titles. One evening, Connor approached her after training. He looked her over with his usual stern expression, then said, "You've come a long way. I didn't think you'd make it this far." Zahira wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not. "I still have a lot to learn," she replied. "That's true," Connor said, smirking slightly. "But it's not just about fighting anymore. The others are starting to follow you. They're watching what you do, how you handle yourself. That's the first sign of leadership." She stared at him, unsure how to respond. Leadership. She had spent her entire life being told she wasn't worthy of that. "Being a leader isn't about shouting orders or being the strongest," Connor continued. "It's about setting the example. Show them how to face fear, how to think under pressure. They'll respect you for it." Zahira thought about his words long after he left. She had always believed she was meant to serve, to follow. But now she wondered if she could be more. The next day, Connor put her theory to the test. During a large training exercise, he handed her the responsibility of planning the team's strategy. The task was simple: lead a small group of soldiers in a mock battle against another team. Zahira's heart raced. What if she failed? What if she embarrassed herself in front of everyone? But then she looked at her teammates, humans who had once mocked her. They were watching her closely, waiting for her to decide. She took a deep breath and began laying out her plan. Instead of a direct attack, she suggested a diversion. While half the group created a distraction, the other half would move in from the sides. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The team followed her instructions, and they won the mock battle. Her teammates cheered, slapping her on the back. In that moment, something shifted inside Zahira. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not just as a warrior, but as a leader. She met Connor's gaze, and for once, he gave her a rare smile. "Not bad, alien." After months of training and proving herself, Zahira finally felt stronger, physically, mentally, and emotionally. She was no longer the timid girl her father had cast aside. She had fought, learned, and earned her place among the human soldiers. But just as she was starting to settle into her new life, a message arrived from her home planet. Silvera. King Cyril, her father, was summoning her back. Zahira felt a surge of mixed emotions. Returning to Silvera meant facing the very people who had called her weak, including her father. She didn't know why he wanted her back, but she couldn't ignore the call. When Zahira told Connor Voss about the message, he simply nodded. "You're ready. Whatever happens, remember everything you've learned here." Her journey back to Silvera felt surreal. The once intimidating halls of the royal palace no longer made her feel small. Instead of trembling before her father's golden gaze, she stood tall. "Ah, my daughter," King Cyril said, his tone cold as ever. "You've returned. I trust you've learned something from your time among the humans." Zahira met his piercing gaze without flinching. "I've learned more than you can imagine." The king's expression remained unreadable. "Good. You'll need it. The council has doubts about you, as always. But now that you're back, you'll have the chance to prove yourself, or fail completely." Zahira clenched her fists. She didn't care about the council's opinions anymore. She wasn't here to gain their approval. She was here to show them who she had become. The king waved a hand, and a group of royal guards entered the throne room. They were Xelvera's elite warriors, towering figures clad in ceremonial armor. "You'll face them in a demonstration," King Cyril said. "The council will decide if you're fit to return to your place in this court." Zahira's heart pounded, but she nodded. "Very well. I'll fight them." Her opponent stepped forward, a seasoned guard named Torek. He was known for his strength and skill, and Zahira could hear the whispers of the council. "She doesn't stand a chance. She'll embarrass herself again." But Zahira blocked out their voices. She gripped the weapon given to her, an unfamiliar Xelverian blade, and prepared to face Torek. When the fight began, Torek came at her fast, his strikes heavy and relentless. The audience gasped as he pushed her back. But Zahira wasn't the same inexperienced princess. She used what she had learned from Connor and the humans. Instead of meeting Torek's power head-on, she dodged, sidestepped, and made him miss. Her movements were faster, more precise. When she saw an opening, she struck. Torek staggered, and Zahira didn't hesitate. She pressed her advantage, knocking him off balance and forcing him to yield. The throne room fell silent. Even the council looked stunned. Zahira turned to her father, who stared at her with a mix of surprise and something else, perhaps a glimmer of respect. "Good," the king said after a long pause. "Perhaps you've learned more than I expected." Zahira's victory was only the beginning. She knew her father's approval was far from guaranteed, but she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful. She had faced her past, and won. Zahira felt a surge of triumph after defeating Torek, but she knew her journey was far from over. The murmurs of the council still filled the chamber, their skepticism unshaken despite her victory. King Cyril, seated on his towering throne, leaned forward slightly. His gaze, cold and calculating, settled on her. "Your skills have improved," he said, his voice measured. "But a single fight proves little. Our enemies do not test us one-on-one. They strike in numbers. Tell me, daughter, are you ready to lead an army against them?" An army. The thought made Zahira's chest tighten. She had fought alongside humans in training, but leading an entire force was something entirely different. Still, she squared her shoulders and met her father's gaze. "I am ready," she said firmly. The king nodded slowly, then gestured for the guards to bring in the next test. But before anyone could move, a young Xelverian messenger rushed into the chamber. His armor was battered, his breathing ragged. "Your Majesty," the messenger cried, "the Ralnath invaders have breached the outer territories. They are marching toward our capital as we speak." The council erupted in chaos. Zahira caught snippets of their panic-stricken conversation. "Our defenses aren't prepared. The outer wall can't hold them. We must evacuate the civilians." King Cyril's face darkened. He raised a hand, silencing the council. Then he turned his golden eyes on Zahira. "You claim to be ready to lead," he said. "Now is your chance. Take command of our forces and repel the Ralnath." Zahira's heart pounded. This was no practice battle. These were real invaders, real lives on the line. She looked around the chamber, seeing the doubt etched into every face. No one believed she could succeed. Except, perhaps, Connor. Before leaving Earth, he had told her, "Your strength comes from how you face the impossible. If you can think, adapt, and act under pressure, you'll win more than you'll lose." She clung to those words now. If she hesitated, she would prove them right. If she doubted herself, she would fail before the fight even began. "I'll do it," she said. The king gave a curt nod. "Then go. The Ralnith will show no mercy." Zahira turned and strode out of the chamber, her steps steady despite the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. As she moved toward the command center, a few of the guards muttered under their breath, "She's not ready. She'll fail like always." But a different voice cut through their words. "I wouldn't bet against her now," one of the human soldiers said, his tone calm and certain. "She's got more fight in her than you realize." Zahira felt a flicker of reassurance. The human she had trained with believed in her. They had seen her transform from a frightened outcast into a determined fighter. Now she had to prove that she could be a leader, a warrior, a commander who could stand tall against the Ralnith and protect her people. As Zahira stood on the city's outer wall, the horizon ahead filled with the dark shapes of the Ralnith army. The alien invaders moved in a disciplined formation, their ranks stretching far beyond what she had expected. The sight of them sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to let her fear show. Around her, the Xelvarian soldiers were restless. They whispered among themselves, casting uncertain glances at her. She knew what they were thinking. This was the king's unwanted daughter, the weak princess who had no business leading an army. But she didn't let their doubts stop her. Zahira turned to her officers, her voice steady as she gave orders. "Station the archers along the walls. Prepare the heavy cannons. And when the Ralnith move into range, focus fire on their siege engines," she commanded. Her officers hesitated for only a moment before nodding and relaying her instructions. The soldiers scrambled into position, and soon the wall was bristling with weapons. Zahira had studied the terrain carefully. The Ralnith were advancing through a narrow pass, their heavy artillery slowing them down. If she could destroy their siege engines before they reached the walls, her army would have a chance. The first wave of Ralnith warriors charged, their guttural battle cries echoing through the air. Zahira raised her hand. "Hold," she shouted. The Xelvarian soldiers gripped their weapons tightly, their faces tense. "Hold," she said again, her voice rising above the noise. When the Ralnith forces were within striking distance, Zahira brought her hand down. "Fire." The walls came alive with a barrage of arrows and cannon blasts. The sound was deafening as the projectiles tore into the Ralnith front lines. The invaders faltered, their advance slowed by the relentless assault. Zahira watched closely, her sharp eyes searching for their siege engines. She spotted them at the rear, massive machines of war slowly rumbling forward. "Focus on the siege engines," she called out. The heavy cannons turned their attention to the rear, firing shot after shot. One by one, the Ralnith's towering machines began to collapse under the bombardment. A cheer rose from the Xelvarian soldiers as the invaders' formation broke apart. But Zahira knew better than to celebrate too soon. "They'll regroup," she said, turning to her officers. "Prepare for another wave. I want every soldier ready. We hold this wall at all costs." As the soldiers rushed to resupply their weapons, a figure approached Zahira, one of her lieutenants, a veteran warrior who had once doubted her. "You did well," he said quietly, his expression filled with a mixture of respect and surprise. "They're listening to you." Zahira met his gaze. "They don't need to listen to me. They need to survive." Her eyes turned back to the battlefield, where the Ralnith were already reorganizing for another attack. She clenched her fists. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Zahira believed she could lead her people to victory. As Zahira stood on the city's outer wall, the horizon ahead filled with the dark shapes of the Ralnith army. The alien invaders moved in a disciplined formation, their ranks stretching far beyond what she had expected. The sight of them sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to let her fear show. Around her, the Xelvarian soldiers were restless. They whispered among themselves, casting uncertain glances at her. She knew what they were thinking. This was the king's unwanted daughter, the weak princess who had no business leading an army. But she didn't let their doubts stop her. Zahira turned to her officers, her voice steady as she gave orders. Station the archers along the walls. Prepare the heavy cannons. And when the Ralmith move into range, focus fire on their siege engines, she commanded. Her officers hesitated for only a moment before nodding and relaying her instructions. The soldiers scrambled into position, and soon the wall was bristling with weapons. Zahira had studied the terrain carefully. The Ralmith were advancing through a narrow pass, their heavy artillery slowing them down. If she could destroy their siege engines before they reached the walls, her army would have a chance. The first wave of Ralmith warriors charged, their guttural battle cries echoing through the air. Zahira raised her hand. "Hold," she shouted. The Excelvarian soldiers gripped their weapons tightly, their faces tense. "Hold," she said again, her voice rising above the noise. When the Ralmith forces were within striking distance, Zahira brought her hand down. "Fire." The walls came alive with a barrage of arrows and cannon blasts. The sound was deafening as the projectiles tore into the Ralmith front lines. The invaders faltered, their advance slowed by the relentless assault. Zahira watched closely, her sharp eyes searching for their siege engines. She spotted them at the rear, massive machines of war slowly rumbling forward. "Focus on the siege engines," she called out. The heavy cannons turned their attention to the rear, firing shot after shot. One by one, the Ralmith's towering machines began to collapse under the bombardment. A cheer rose from the Excelvarian soldiers as the invaders' formation broke apart, but Zahira knew better than to celebrate too soon. "They'll regroup," she said, turning to her officers. "Prepare for another wave. I want every soldier ready. We hold this wall at all costs." As the soldiers rushed to resupply their weapons, a figure approached Zahira, one of her lieutenants, a veteran warrior who had once doubted her. "You did well," he said quietly, his expression filled with a mixture of respect and surprise. "They're listening to you." Zahira met his gaze. "They don't need to listen to me. They need to survive." Her eyes turned back to the battlefield, where the Ralmith were already reorganizing for another attack. She clenched her fists. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Zahira believed she could lead her people to victory.